layers and how they're used, which are really at the heart of Photoshop. And of course, we also had some familiarity with layers from Illustrator from the weeks before that, but they do work a little bit differently in Photoshop. I wanted to give an overview, start out by giving an overview of what Photoshop is used for, and some of which we'll be doing and some of which we won't, simply because we just, within the context of a semester, don't have time for. The first two are related but not quite the same: photo correction and photo retouching. Correction refers to basically making a photo so that it is more visually pleasing. This might include lightening or darkening parts of it. It might include emphasizing or de-emphasizing part of it, just making it as pleasing as it can be. Now, if you're a print designer like I am, photo correction also means getting a picture's color space into what is achievable with print. I talk about this throughout my classes, but basically your computer monitor or your iPad is a source of light. It's got millions of teensy tiny little light bulbs in there. And as a source of light, it just can provide a wider color gamut than is capable with print. And so if you're a print designer, a lot of times you get photos that are going to print muddy or murky if you don't do something with them. Photo retouching is much more changing what that photo is about. And it might be simple things like whitening teeth or getting rid of pimples, or it might be much more complex like changing a background or taking someone out of a photograph. If you say you have you're trying to focus on one person and there's someone unwanted in the frame, you might remove them or do something like that. And whether you're doing that kind of work or not really depends on what you're doing as a designer. I work for news sources, and as a designer who works for news organizations, there's very little you can do to a photograph and still be sort of journalistically honest. There are very minor things like I've made skies appear a little bit taller so that a horizontal photo becomes a vertical photo, but you would not change the content of an image in a way that would be deceptive. I do a bit of illustration. And some of that is like we did last week, sort of collage-y stuff. But if you work for an editorial source, a lot of designers spend some of their time doing what I would consider in-house illustration. And most of that, not all of it, but most of it is in Photoshop. And if I turn you to my Pinterest page, and I keep this because if I see something I like, I just hang on to it for inspiration. But I have a page, and my overall name is on the syllabus of how to find me on Pinterest. But I have a page devoted to in-house inspiration and the in-house illustration, and these are all things. Well, this one I did, but the rest of these are things that I like and might want to do something like them someday if I have a chance. It's just sort of my quick board. So here's an example of one. I wish Pinterest showed you a bigger image, but there you go. And that is like a in-house illustration, almost certainly done in Photoshop by a in-house designer. And so designers do end up, depending on where they work, a lot of that. You can also use Photoshop for typographical effects. If you want your type to look blurry or look like it's turning into smoke, or look like any other number of special effects, it helps to get into Photoshop where you can treat your type like pixels. Web designers and UX designers tend to use Photoshop as their primary program. That's not something I've done a lot of, but a lot of designers do. There are tools specifically for that now. But a lot of, especially designers who have been around for a few years, are still working in Photoshop as to design web pages. And web programmers like that, because of Photoshop's multiple layers, you can send your developer your Photoshop file, and they can go into the layers. And if you have a texture or a background, they can isolate that. It's not a monolithic thing. They can grab little pieces of it and incorporate it into their code in a way that will display as the designer intended on screen. Now, you can also do at least limited animation in Photoshop. You probably, if you were a serious animator, you would not be using Photoshop for animation, but you can do sort of simple things in there. And I think we talk about that later on. And you can also do 3D rendering and texturing in Photoshop. Again, if you're a serious 3D person, you're probably not using Photoshop as your 3D tool. But if you do occasional 3D, and I've done that occasionally, then Photoshop does that just fine. So how have I used it? My past publication had an annual beer issue. And once I designed the logo for that issue as a beer label, and then I used the 3D to render that label on a cylinder so that I could later put it on a couple of different bottles of beer so it looked like it was part of the photograph. And that's the sort of 3D that designers do quite a bit. And then you can also use it video editing and rendering. And again, if you're a serious video editor, Photoshop is probably not where you're going to, but you can use it for that. Photoshop has a timeline, and you can bring in video clips, and there are tools specifically designed for working with them. And so I wanted to go over this. We will not have time to do all of these, but you are working in probably the biggest and most complex program in the Creative Suite, and the one that does the most. So last week we talked about layers. I want to focus in this week on image making, on the painting and rendering tool. So I think I'm going to create a new document. And I think I'll just keep it a letter and make it a horizontal letter. And we can open it up. And just like as with last time, you can just start painting on this or create a new layer if you want it to work in a less destructive way, or whatever you want. Let's make sure, oh yes, I'm at the bottom. So let's look at the mark making tools, and a lot of these tools over on the left are for making marks, and a lot of them will behave the same sort of way. So if we select the brush, you can just accept it and draw it, but you can also control a number of things about it. How it performs. It can have a transparency mode, for example. I usually don't do that, although this one is set for an opacity of 34. That just must have been whatever I left it at. And we can change that, and then we have a full 100% opacity. You can also affect the flow, which is a little bit different than opacity, and we can see a little bit more of the texture in this particular brush coming out. But I'm going to put that back to 100. There's also a pencil tool, which I hardly ever use, but it's there. And I'm not going to get into those two brushes right now. Those are probably more advanced than we have time for. But if you put down a mark and you don't like it, you can always Command Z to undo it, and you can keep going. But there's also an eraser tool, and that's this guy right here, where I could come in and just start erasing it. Now, one of the things I want you to notice about that eraser is I'm erasing it, and let's just zoom in on it. It's giving me this really kind of bumpy and awkward line. It's just a little bit not smooth, and that is Photoshop's default, because it is trying to make the brushes move as quickly as possible, and if you have a slower system, your brush performs a little bit more quickly. But if you want that smooth, you have to go into the brush engine, and let me select my, oops, wrong tool, let me select my eraser, and we see that this brush has a spacing, and we see that it has a bunch of other stuff too, and almost also more than we can get into. But I can loosen the spacing, and I can make that an even lumpier eraser, or I could smooth it, which is what I do most of the time, to get a much smoother flow from out of my brush. And you can also select the kind of brush it is. I have to be over something. Let me just switch back to my brush tool. And that has a smoother spacing already. Oh, forgive me, I'm using key commands on a Mac. If you hold down Option and Control, you can change the size of your brush. But you can also do it up here at the top of your menu. We can make this a smaller or bigger brush. The other thing we can do is we can make this a harder or blurrier brush. So we could take my hardness down all the way to 0. And no, for this brush that's not going to work. Let's pick something else. Let's take my hardness down to 0. Oh, wrong brush. I'll just select a different brush. There we go. So now it should work because it's on a fancy custom brush. That's opacity. I could take my hardness down to 0, and then I get something that looks like spray paint or an old-fashioned airbrush, which people used to use for photograph retouching in the days before Photoshop. But in this tool, the soft brush is used a lot for retouching photographs. And I tend to like to do everything with my keyboard that I can. So if you want to get those bigger, your brush bigger or softer without running to the menu, if you hold down your Control and Option key on a Mac, you can go left or right and make that brush bigger. It's just giving you a little preview of it, or up and down. And there are other mark making tools that we will talk about in the coming weeks, like this clone stamp, but all of them will work roughly the same way with the spacing. You can open up the brush engine for all of them, and you can control a lot of things that include how the colors interact with what's beneath it, and the texture that comes out of the brush, and a bunch of other stuff. And I would say the best way to get a handle on those is to either just fool around with them, or you will find that there are LinkedIn learning classes that go pretty deeply into all of these things as well. So let's zoom back out of this composition, such as it is. And I want to also talk about the pen tool in Photoshop, because sometimes that's useful for a couple of things. I talked about it in terms of making selections last week, but it can also be useful in terms of painting if you are and are comfortable with the pen tool, because you can control strokes a little bit more accurately than you could drawing with a mouse or on your touch pad. So I'm just going to take my pen tool, and it works exactly the same way it does in Illustrator. I can draw out a curve point, and another curve point, and another curve point, and I think I'm going to make a closed path. But just as with Illustrator, I can hold down my Option key, and I can make a corner point or change my mind. This all works the way you're familiar with. Now, sometimes if I'm making a path because I'm trying to just do a little bit of painting with it, I probably won't save it, but normally I almost always save my paths because it's useful to have later on, and for another reason that we'll talk about when we get into InDesign. So I'm just going to save this, and to do that, you just click on the name, and you can accept path 1, but I'll just call this paint path, and click OK. So I just switched and I'm still in my painting workspace from last week, but we can see the channels and the paths that I just made and the layers. These are all sort of the important parts. So once I have this path, I can, let's pick a different color, and I can use my little color picker to pick a different color, or I can use my swatches. I'll just stick with that green. So once I have done that, and I have this path selected, if I'm working on a layer I can paint on, I can also stroke that path. So let's go back to, let's just select a interesting brush, and I'm gonna stroke that path, pushing this little stroke button. And I think it did it. I think just my brush is too small. So let's, make my brush a little bit bigger. Yeah, it was a teeny tiny little brush. So now let's stroke it. And that can be a way of controlling your strokes more precisely. You can also take this shape and give it a fill. Let's switch the color to something else, maybe a black. And then I will just click this little fill button, and I have filled that brush. Now, one thing that happened when I did that is it filled all the way up to the edge of the path, whereas the stroke sort of is center focused on the path. So I had a little bit of a roughness on the inside. So if you want this sort of look, but you wanted the brush stroke to look organic on both sides, and let's get another color, and then let's stroke that again. So then you get a little bit more of the sense of the strokiness on both sides. And a path could be open or closed. Let me just draw one more quick little pen tool. And okay, and let's get a different color. And then we can, I need to be in my brush. That's the one thing that's a little bit annoying about this, is going back between your tools. So let's do that. And so now I've stroked that in a different color. And if I basically ignore this path, it will eventually go away on its own unless I save it. Or maybe it's thinking of this as part of the paint path because I have that one selected. So I'll just delete that path. So your assignment for this week is to do either a digital painting or a digital piece of graffiti. You can use multiple layers if you want to work non-destructively, or you can just work on the background layer, as I have done for this demonstration. And so I would say try out some brushes and try out some paths, and make a piece of art that uses multiple size brushes and multiple brushes. And that is it for this week.